Learning goal number 25, congruent polygons. All right, learning goal number 25, congruent polygons. Let's get started here. So this is a major idea in geometry, and we need to completely understand this idea of what congruency means. So if two polygons are congruent, it means they have the same shape and size. So like these two triangles have the same shape, but they also have to have the same size. And what that means is that every single angle has to be congruent to a matching angle, and every single side has to have a matching side it's congruent to, or all of their corresponding parts, but we'll talk about that later. So to fully understand that these two triangles are congruent, we have to have congruent angles. Meaning, if you look, angle A looks to be congruent to angle X. And I'm going to tell you that they are. We're just going to assume that. So angle A is congruent to angle X. And we mark it with these little arcs to represent congruency for the angles. And I show you that angle A, this is the congruent symbol, has like a little equal sign, and then there's a little like a, whatever you want to call it, above it, and then angle X. And then angle B here is congruent to angle Y, and I'm going to mark that with two arcs. So we separate that these two are congruent, but they're not congruent to the other two. That's important. Angle B is congruent to angle Y. Because if I only put one arc here and one arc there, what you're saying is that, hey, yeah, those two are congruent, but they're also the same measure as those two, which we don't want to say, for sure. And then finally, angle C here, that's congruent to angle Z. And notice I've used three arcs, right? All right, so that represents that these two polygons have the same shape. Their angles are the same, so they have the same shape. Three angles. This one's congruent to that one, this one to that one, and this one to that one. Three angles congruent to three angles. Great. Now, for them to have the same size, they have to have congruent sides. So that means that side AB here has to be congruent to side XY. And I label it like this. Side AB has to be congruent to side XY. Very good. A lot of notation here. Very important. And then also side BC would have to be congruent to side YZ. And I'm going to mark that with two dashes instead of one to show that they're congruent to each other, but not to the other two lines, if that makes sense. So we got BC, and that is congruent to YZ. And then finally, the third side, AC, has to be congruent to the third side, XZ also. So AC has to be congruent to XZ. And again, what we need to understand here is that for a polygon to be congruent, they have to have the same shape, meaning every angle over here has to have a matching angle it's congruent to over there. So A and X, B and Y, C and Z. And it has to have the same size. So this side is the same length as that side, and this side to that side, and this side to that side. Same shape and same size makes polygons congruent. So these two polygons are congruent because their angles are congruent and their sides. They're corresponding parts, which means they're matching parts. This angle matches that angle, congruent. Angle matches that angle, congruent. Angle matches that angle, congruent. Side, 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 side. All the angles have a matching corresponding side that it's congruent to, and corresponding angle. Same thing with the sides. All right, now we have this thing called a congruent statement. And a congruent statement basically shows you what parts in what order match. So the easiest way to write a congruent statement is just to identify the first triangle. We'll call it triangle ABC. We can call it triangle BCA, CBA. We can name this first one whatever order we want in either clockwise or counterclockwise order. But however we name the first one, the second one depends upon it. So triangle ABC, is congruent to triangle, well, what goes along with A? X. So that has to be listed first. And what goes along with B? Y. That has to be listed second. And what goes along with C? Z. That has to go third. And your congruent statement has to be in order so that you can see that A goes with X, B goes with Y, and C goes with Z. And even if you look closely, you can see that A, B are right next to each other, side AB. X, Y are right next to each other, side XY. AB is actually congruent to XY. And BC here is congruent to YZ here. And then finally, AC, the first and the last, is congruent to XZ. AC, XZ. So the congruent statement tells you a lot of information. All right, so let's take a look at an example here. And again, I'm going to go through this example. The goal is to identify, are these congruent polygons here and here? If so, what are their corresponding parts, matching parts? Like what angles are congruent and what sides are congruent, which I just showed you in the first slide there. And then I want to write a congruent statement. So if I take a look here, I see 3 angles in each one. I see H is marked congruent to P. Good. And K to Q. Good. And J to M. Great. I got 3 angles and they all have a congruent angle in the other triangle. Now let's look at the sides. You see a side here that's 6 centimeters? It falls between H and K, and H goes along with P, and K goes along with Q. So this side basically goes from there to there. And this side is 6 centimeters, and this side is 6 centimeters, which means they're congruent. Great. Go to this one. It falls between K and J. K goes along with Q, J goes along with M. So this side goes right there. 3 centimeters, 3 centimeters. Great. Congruent and congruent. And then finally, J and H. J goes along with M and H goes with P. 5 centimeters, 5 centimeters. So what I have just basically shown is that all of your angles, your corresponding angles are congruent. So the matching angles, angle H and angle P, they are congruent. And angle K and angle Q, they are congruent. And angle J and angle M, they are congruent. I want to identify the angles that are congruent, which I just did. And then I want to identify the sides that are congruent. Side HK is congruent to side PQ. And side KJ here is congruent to side QM there. And then finally JH is congruent to MP. If you can show that all the corresponding parts of the 2 triangles are congruent, then the triangles are congruent, or the polygons. Doesn't have to be triangles, it could be any polygon. By corresponding parts, I mean angles and sides. If you can show that the matching angle pairs are congruent and the matching side pairs are congruent, then you got congruent triangles. And then you can write your congruent statement. Congruent statement can start in any order. So let's just call this triangle KJH. Triangle KJH is congruent to triangle, well, what goes along with K? Q. What goes along with J? M. What goes along with H? P. So KJH is congruent to QMP. Okay, so now you need to try a few problems on your own. You can find these problems in your workbook on page 99. But if you don't have your workbook, here's a picture.